Is it because his speaker was also?
Could be. So we can't see them. Okay.
Maybe
John, are you there? Maybe not yet.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, John. So we're thinking of maybe how to show our students in this class the main classroom in Beijing. Is that something you can enable on your side?
So the classroom in Beijing is already the video is already up.
Okay, so can we show? I can't see that video, but maybe it would be nice to, if possible.
Okay. I'm going to see if my classroom team can set that up.
Great.
They're working on it right now.
Okay.
It may be an issue that you're sharing your PowerPoint right now, and so that might be kind of.
Well, it's no big deal. I just thought it might be nice for our classroom to be able to see yours, but it's not a big deal.
We'll try to do it. They're still working on it.
Okay.
唔係佢 Owl connect 咗，但係佢冇畫面。係啊，聲有。我 connect 咗啦，唔係 Zoom 啊，用 Zoom 騰訊係。
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Got it.
係咪有另外一部嘅嘢？好。
Oh, it's okay. They can see. I'll just stay near here and see.
One other thing is that our cameras are fixed at the Beta classrooms, and they face the front rather than the back.
Okay. Well, it's fine, John. Don't worry about it. I think we have our own limitations over here too. So.
Right.
Yeah, because we should get started. It's okay. Let's leave it as is, and it's fine. I think.
All right, we'll get started in about 2 minutes, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, John, we had plugged in one of these Owl devices that supposedly can, look around and track the room. And then our tech guy just said that actually that doesn't support Voov. It's only for Zoom. So we're not sure that's in fact working. You may be just seeing me through the laptop, right?
I'm seeing you through 3 different cameras.
Oh, so it is working.
Yeah.
I think the Owl is working then.
I'm not sure what that does for me as a viewer, but
it may not.
It's certainly interesting.
It's kind of for conference calls. I think it's good for that, where you can see a few different people at once talking. Not really necessary in our case, perhaps.
Yeah. That's pretty funny that it only works with Zoom and they installed it.
Well, that's what they said, although apparently it also seems to be working with Voov.
Yeah.
As they say, the call is working. Okay, John, I have 10:10. Shall we get started?
Sure, let's do it. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name's John Alekna. I'm an assistant professor of the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine department at Peking University. And this is our Frontiers in the History of Science lecture series. where we invite people working on exciting new projects in the histories of science, technology, medicine, and in this case, knowledge, a subject very dear to my own heart. Today's guest lecturer is Joshua Ehrlich, who is an assistant professor at the University of Macau. So we are very excited to be connected to our sister university down in the south, where I'm sure it is much warmer than in Beijing, and probably much nicer weather there. Josh is going to give you a little background. He received his undergraduate degree from the University of Chicago and his graduate degrees and PhD from Harvard University. And he has been teaching at the University of Macau for several years now, I believe, and had just come out with his first book, which will be the topic of today's talk, The East India Company and the Politics of Knowledge. An exciting volume, which I have been carrying around with me for the last couple of weeks, slowly enjoying. And I have a lot of questions, and was very excited by a lot of the ideas which you introduce. And I'm very excited to hear your talk. So without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Josh.
Well, thank you so much, John, and hi to everyone in the classroom here, as well as everyone at Beida, and I gather at other universities in China. It's wonderful to be with you, and I hope next time we can do this in person. I'm happy also to hear that my book is available. I'm working on getting a Chinese translation prepared and published and available, so hopefully that's also forthcoming. So I'm going to be talking today about the book and fielding any questions that people may have about it. It's a nice chance to think about this topic from the perspective of the history of science and history of knowledge, which is often thought of as an offshoot of the history of science. I have my own approach to the history of knowledge that is really one of the points of the book to advance. I'm going to talk about that today in some detail, given the audience and given the perhaps greater than usual interest in the methodology behind this book, as well as the content and substance of the book. I think all of that is part of the presentation today. So the book came out in June, and I've been thinking both about how to present it and where to move forward in my own ideas from this book. I think I will just get started and tell you how I came up with the original idea 10 years ago as a graduate student, thinking about a topic for a dissertation. And the students in my classroom here are mostly undergraduates, but they themselves will be preparing a larger scale project for their BA thesis as fourth years. So this may not be irrelevant to them either, thinking of how to start a project. What caught my eye and really formed the impetus for this project was a quote I encountered. I was looking through material, thinking about potential ideas, potential topics for the book, or what was then the dissertation. I landed on, in my browsing, a pamphlet written by Jacques-Pierre Rousseau, who would later be involved with the French Revolution as a moderate, who at this time in 1783 was engaged in a kind of mimicry of the great philosophe in Paris, the leading lights of the Enlightenment. He was across the channel at this time in London and envisioning a great project, a great learned society that would gather the world's information together. And in the course of describing this project, he gave the following quote: "Commerce may be rendered subservient to the promotion of science, and the same ship that carries the East India Company's orders to Calcutta may likewise carry the new instruments or the new work, and may bring back the Indian book for the student of Göttingen or the professor of Oriental languages at Paris." I'm going to maybe switch to the microphone here.
Set up, use the microphone.
Yeah.
This one. This one. Because what's this here? For this is the mouse or something?
Yeah.
Sorry. Before this one. Pick up and no.
Just do it quickly, please.
Yes. Okay, this one, try. And that microphone as DAT this one.
Okay, so shall I continue like this? Everyone can hear me on both sides?
Sure, both are good. The microphone is slightly better, but they were both good.
Okay, let's resume. So this quote raised several questions for me immediately. The 1780s were a time when the East India Company was under increasing pressure on both sides of its operations. Critics in London and in Britain and even in Europe, at the same time as critics in Bengal and more broadly in South Asia, were reacting to the company's rapid conquest of its first territorial empire in Bengal, something that had happened in just a few short years, beginning in the 1750s. The company overnight, it seemed, had gone from being a merchant to a sovereign, and a powerful sovereign at that. So why this language about this enlightened company trading instruments and books at a time when the company was better known for the violence of its conquest and the rapacity of its extraction of resources from its new empire? I wondered how this rhetoric was intended and what lay behind it. At the same time, I wondered about another thing. You see also in this description the company being portrayed as really a merchant carrying things to and fro. At this moment when it had assumed the mantle of sovereignty directly in Bengal, at the moment when it seemed very unlike a merchant in the traditional sense, why was it still being portrayed this way as a trading outfit, bringing things one way and the other? So these are the kind of questions that led me to look further. What I soon found was that Brissot's rhetoric was scarcely original. And anyone who's heard about Brissot before may have heard about him from the great cultural historian of France, Robert Darnton, who famously portrayed Brissot as a literary hack, a kind of Grub Street mimic of Enlightenment ideas, not a major thinker. And so it seemed fitting, in fact, that a character like this would be picking up ideas like a magpie from other sources. These ideas, I found quickly, originated within the company itself. The company itself, its advocates, its officials, were very much portraying it as this enlightened organization, trading not only in material goods, but also in intellectual goods. So I wanted to understand why it would be doing this at this moment. This is probably not our image of the company today, and it was not the image of the company for critics. So to understand this rhetoric and the kind of ideas that lay behind it, I would have to return to a few subjects that historians had treated already before. First of all, of course, the company's ideology. Second, its relationship between commerce and politics, between being a merchant and being a sovereign, both sides of its dual character, bound together in its constitution. I would have to return to that hybrid constitution and understand it and how it was changing at this time. And finally, I would have to return to the company's engagements with knowledge, a subject that had been treated much before, but never in this exact context, never really in relation to its changing character, the shift in emphasis from its trading to its governing activities. All of this I would have to revisit if I was to understand statements like this being made and circulated in the 1780s.
I found soon that this story went well beyond the 1780s and was in a large sense integral to the story of the company's later existence. Knowledge became a cornerstone of the company's ideology and remained there from the 1770s all the way till the 1750s, when the company finally was disbanded. I will say much more about all of that in the rest of my presentation. So because this is a rather long presentation, I thought I would give a quick roadmap. I'm going to introduce the topic a bit, say a bit more about the East India Company, which I don't take for granted people will have known much about before this talk. I'm going to outline my argument and then dwell in a little bit of detail on the kind of interventions I hope this project makes, especially methodological interventions, since I know this is a group of historians of science and technology and even of knowledge who may be interested in how this presents a new method for approaching those subjects. I'm then going to spend a bit of time going through the chapters of the book, not, of course, trying to capture everything in them, but outlining them and saying sort of how the argument progresses chronologically and thematically through those chapters. And then I will conclude with a few thoughts on the relevance of this topic today, a moment when we again see states and companies overlapping in the realm of knowledge, each claiming some role in knowledge arenas like publishing, education, medical, and scientific research. The story of the company's own engagements with knowledge and the debated relations among companies, states, and knowledge may not be such an exotic story for us today. It may not be so remote. In fact, there are many ways that those debates that the company engaged in over many decades have resources that we might recover for use in our own debates. I'll get to that at the end. So the company is remembered today as the world's most powerful corporation. That's the subtitle of a recent summary of the company in book form. That's the kind of comparison that gets drawn. It's talked about as the Google of 200 years ago or something like that. You can see that it retains some kind of purchase on popular culture. The video above shows some fans of the Pirates of the Caribbean series cosplaying as East India Company members. The company's flag is in the background there. I think it's the second film in that series that involves the East India Company. And in fact, the East India Company's original charter has been resuscitated by a Gujarati businessman who now sells overpriced tea in places like Harrods and Terminal 5 of Heathrow Airport in London. So the company still is with us. It still has some kind of notoriety or cachet today. It was, of course, notorious in its own day. And this was true almost from its very beginnings in 1600. It was founded to manage English trade with Asia, which was roughly called the East Indies in a pretty imprecise geographical description. From its very beginning, it was a hybrid entity, a company state, meaning that it had both political and commercial rights and responsibilities. It was licensed by the English Crown and later by the British Crown after the Union of England and Scotland, not only to trade, but to manage all kinds of aspects of its trading operations. So this involved conducting diplomacy with Asian rulers. To manage its trade, it needed to have a lot of powers to conduct diplomacy. The English state itself had little resources and presence in Asia. It relied on chartered companies to do a lot of its diplomacy. The company was the major outfit of the crown in Asia. The company could also raise armies. Again, the state did not provide armies or navies to defend the company's interests. The company had to take care of these roles itself. It could go to war on its own initiative without the permission of the crown. It could even mint currency One of the things we think of as most central to sovereignty today is minting coins with the kind of images and representations and authority of the state behind them. The company could do this for itself. It could make it administer laws, another thing we think of as the prerogative of the state. It had to both form regulations for governing its small trading settlements, for keeping order, for preventing and punishing crime. It could administer law courts, set them up and oversee them and staff them. And finally, it could govern territory. Initially, these territories were very small. The trading posts around the South Asian littoral, from Bombay to Madras to Calcutta to other ports in Southeast Asia, which eventually included Singapore, Malacca, and of course, its factories in Canton, Guangzhou. All of these were acquired over a period of time. Some were lost, some were gained. But this was a facet of the company's operations from the beginning, governing these small trading settlements set up to give the company access to Asian goods, which it could then trade back to Europe. So from the very beginning, I've been suggesting, really summarizing here the work of Phil Stern, the company was a company state. But it changed dramatically. The meaning of that hybrid constitution, the importance of that political character really changed dramatically over the next 250 years. A brief timeline may help us see these changes. The company, as I said, was founded in 1600, but it was changed fundamentally in 1757 by the Battle of Plassey. The company had come into conflict with the governor of Bengal, who was himself a nominally subject to the Mughal emperor in Delhi. And as a result of this conflict, the company took over the governor's territory. The company's own local capital in Calcutta was first invaded. Then the governor's, the Nawab's troops were repelled. The company came into possession not only of its own capital again, but of all of the Nawab's territories in Bengal. This was the beginning of its existence as a large-scale territorial ruler. The province of Bengal was the richest in the Mughal Empire. It was bigger than all of Great Britain at that time. So all of a sudden, the East India Company was in control of a kingdom or territory larger than that which had chartered it, larger than Great Britain itself. This was the beginning of its ascent into the major player in South Asian politics, the dominant power in all of the Indian subcontinent. That transformation was complete by 1818. In fits and starts, the company made alliances and enmities with other powers in South Asia, including the Marathas in the west, Mysore in the south, and of course the mighty Mughals in North and Central India, overtaking all of them by 1818. The last to go, by the way, were the Marathas. And so by 1818, the company had completed this ascent to territorial dominance from its humble beginnings as just one of many political players in South Asia. At the same time, however, that it was emerging as this conqueror and ruler, its trade was dwindling for various reasons. For one thing, it was coming under increasing pressure from private traders in Britain who wanted access to Asian markets and pushed Parliament to regulate the East India Company and reduce or cancel its monopoly. The company's monopoly on the India trade was terminated in 1813 by Parliament, and its trade quickly shriveled. It couldn't compete with private traders. In 1813, its remaining monopoly on the China route. So among British companies, no other traders were allowed access to Canton. That monopoly came to an end 20 years later in 1833. And so for the last couple decades of its existence, the company had no direct involvement in trade whatsoever. It served in some ways as a kind of umbrella organization for other trading interests. It had connections through family and official networks to trade, but it didn't trade at all itself. It was, in fact, purely a government over most of South Asia, containing over 100 million Indian subjects. This final form of the company lasted almost 25 years before the Indian Rebellion, or sometimes in older sources called the Sepoy Mutiny, ended the company's existence. The company is replaced by the Crown after that major uprising in Indian history. So to give you a kind of clearer sense of this transformation, which I've tried to describe in a kind of outline form, you can see here a few maps of India showing the East India Company's territorial ascent. In 1765, you see it formally administering those territories it had conquered since 1757. Those areas shaded pink are Bengal and part of the Carnatic, a little bit south of there. Meanwhile, by 1805, it had extended its control into North India, Awadh, and South India, Mysore. By 1837, you see it extending a little bit further. What isn't really shown on the map are all of its subsidiary alliances, so parts of what's usually called its informal empire. Although there are many areas nominally under Indian rule, in fact, they have a resident from the company at court who makes decisions about external policy. So its influence goes even beyond what's shaded pink on the map. And you see it extending in that little inset to Burma, which was integrated over time into British India. By 1857, the very end of the company's existence, it's extended all the way into what's now Pakistan, the western and northern reaches of India. And so as these maps show, the company emerges in the course of scarcely a century as essentially the precursor to modern India and beyond, including also Burma, including what isn't shown on this map, some additional territories in Southeast Asia like Singapore, Malacca, Penang. But at the same time that it's becoming so territorially dominant, the company is losing its trade, the original purpose for its charter in the first place, the original justification for all these additional rights that came with its dual constitution in 1600. The two big moments, as I mentioned, are 1813, when the company loses its monopoly on the India trade, and 1833, when it loses its other monopoly on the China trade. So I've been giving this kind of background about the company's territorial ascent and commercial decline because I think this story raises huge questions. The company's charter remained largely intact throughout its existence. Until the very end, it paid a dividend to shareholders. It maintained its corporate structure, its small London headquarters throughout its existence. How did it maintain this structure while it was undergoing such transformations? How did it continue to defend its hybrid constitution, its character as a company state, under such radically different circumstances? I think this is the big question, if largely an unanswered question, for historians of the East India Company. And more broadly, for historians of South Asia and the British Empire. So here's the question. As the company evolved into a large-scale territorial ruler, how did it justify this hybrid character as a company state? My answer in this book, which I have to say is a partial answer, there's no one reason, no one way that it justified this. But my partial answer is that it turned to ideas about knowledge. These ideas about knowledge allowed it to justify its hybrid character as a company state, even in these late stages of its existence, when it was something very different than it had started. When it was this territorial ruler over massive swaths of Southern Asia. Because as we saw in the quote from Brissot, which was again echoing comments made again and again by company officials and advocates, the company claimed to be not only the most powerful corporation in the world, but also the most enlightened one. Now, I should say at this point, we may not believe this claim at all. The company was notorious for violence and extraction in its own day, and remains so to some extent today. Yet I think it would be a mistake at the same time to dismiss this claim out of hand as unimportant or as simply a kind of window dressing that had no deeper significance. In other words, I think we should take the claim seriously at an ideological level. By ideology here, I mean a set of ideas used to legitimate political action. So a kind of political language used to justify political actions. Now, ideology is interesting. It goes always a bit deeper than a simple claim that can be made and forgotten. It binds and shapes actions. By committing oneself to an ideology, one sets up an expectation. If one doesn't then meet that expectation, one's legitimacy, one's authority is damaged. One's credibility is damaged. So to maintain credibility, generally speaking, you must act according to your stated values and your intentions. If you don't uphold your ideology, it ceases to work to legitimize your political actions. This, I think, is how ideology works. This is at least how an intellectual historian would think about ideology. And so the company's ideology matters. It's not simply window dressing, even if we don't really believe that it's accurate today, even if we tend to be suspicious of the company's claims, even if we think that they were, have to be balanced against everything else the company is notorious for. They don't mean nothing. And in fact, the company's commitment to the cause of knowledge did push it to take certain actions. It pushed it to engage with knowledge for the sake of its legitimacy, for the sake of justifying its power and its constitution. At this moment of intense pressure, intense criticism of both. In short, my main argument is that a commitment to the cause of knowledge was central to the company's ideology, at least in its late phase from about the 1770s to the 1850s. I want to say a little bit more about this. If that's the main argument, there's a kind of structure to this argument. And rather than try to kind of summarize, I think I will just read the paragraph in my introduction when I lay out this argument. That way everyone can look at it as I read. So apologies for the long text on the next slide, but I decided to present it this way. From almost its founding in 1600, the company sponsored learning in connection with its activities. In the 1770s, when it began to directly govern large territories, this sponsorship assumed an ideological aspect. Warren Hastings, the first Governor General of Bengal, advanced what he called a system of conciliation. He argued that the beleaguered company would gain allies at home and abroad by patronizing European scholar officials and Indian learned elites. The idea of conciliation befitted both merchant and sovereign, and was rooted in both British and Indian political thought. It remained a mainstay of company ideology throughout much of the next 6 decades. Not only did this idea survive the impeachment of Hastings, it flourished and spread, including to the company's court of directors. Lord Wellesley's governor generalship posed a greater challenge. He used knowledge not to defend, but to attack the company state. After his departure, scholar officials and learned elites struggled to find favor with wary company leaders. At the same time, the company's trade dwindled, while its territory expanded dramatically. By the 1820s, it was paramount in India. Its ideas about knowledge began to change accordingly. Rather than conciliate a few elites, officials increasingly sought to convince wider publics of the company's good government. Now, more and more, the idea of conciliation competed with one of mass education. By the late 1830s, the latter had supplanted the former at the heart of the company's ideology. So this is the sort of capsule version of the argument that I lay out throughout the whole book. It's about how, at first, in the 1770s, under this greater than ever pressure and under this difficulty of justifying its dual character, its hybrid character as company state, the company, led in India by the first Governor General Warren Hastings, turns to ideas about knowledge. Specifically, Hastings advances what he calls a system of conciliation. What he says is that the company can conciliate both elites in Britain and in India, the political classes, the power holders on each side of its operations, by patronizing the company's own European scholar officials, as well as Indian learned elites, both of which groups have a lot of sway with political classes. They can influence them, they can give a good name to the company. This idea of conciliation is appropriate for a sovereign. Conciliation is something a king can do. It's also something a merchant can do. Conciliation has a certain connotation with trade and exchange. And so it brings out a kind of commercial mode of politics, which seems appropriate to a company state, and in fact justifies the endurance of that form, which, as I say, is increasingly embattled at this time. Importantly, it's also an idea that befits both a European organization and a South Asian one. It has resonances in South Asian political thought, particularly the idea of sulikul, a Persian concept, which I'll get into a little bit later, perhaps. So this idea, advanced by Hastings, is used to justify the company. It's pursued through a whole host of scholarly activities, including sending missions, expeditions to Bhutan and Tibet, including founding a madrasa or Islamic seminary in Calcutta, and trying to found an analog for Hindus, a Hindu educational institution in Benares, North India. It's used as part of its kind of another way that this is advanced is through the compilation of Hindu and Muslim law codes. So all of these different scholarly projects are part of this system of conciliation that Hastings announces and tries to use to buttress this embattled company. The idea survives even as Hastings is plagued by scandal. He's called back to Britain effectively and put on trial for high crimes and misdemeanors. But it survives this trial and is celebrated anew in the 1790s when Hastings is acquitted. A bigger challenge for conciliation is the rule of Lord Wellesley as Governor General. Wellesley sets himself up as more of a king, more of a sovereign than an employee of the company. He attacks the company from within, tries to shed its commercial image, its commercial activities, tries to assume this imperial mantle of sovereignty in India, and eschews the idea of conciliation, tries to replace it with a model of kind of grandeur, and this is itself embodied in one of his scholarly projects, the College of Fort William. Wellesley himself is recalled, but a new kind of suspicion of scholar officials and scholarly projects is the result of his revolution within the company, his rebellion within the company. So the company's court of directors is suspicious of knowledge after Wellesley's departure and turns against the kind of scholarly patronage that had been pioneered by Hastings and carried on for several decades. By the 1820s, however, new ideas about education are re-entering the company's ideology, replacing those older ideas about scholarly patronage, which had already fallen out of favor. As the company assumes a status of paramountcy in India, this is the word for its achievement of dominance over its rivals in India, it starts to turn to its new kind of responsibilities in that role. It's pushed by publics, both in Britain and South Asia, to be a good governor, and it tries to demonstrate its good government in order to keep hold of its power, even under very changed circumstances. Again, the diminishing of trade here matters too, as well as its rise to territorial dominance. More and more, this idea of conciliation, although it survives in education debates, gives way to a new idea of mass education. In the last few decades of the company's existence, mass education becomes the major way that the company tries to justify its continued power. It moves to the center of the company's ideology and stays there until the company itself is disbanded after the 1857 uprising. Okay, so that's the argument in short. I'm going to turn now to the kind of interventions this argument makes, because I've just given so far a kind of narrative description. This is a history of ideas of knowledge, and I'm going to get into in a moment what that means and how that's different from other approaches to the history of ideas and also to the history of knowledge. What it's doing, what I've just been describing, is tracing ideas of and about knowledge used to legitimize the East India Company. As a matter of what it actually looks at, it focuses on knowledge debates involving the company and its critics, not only British critics, but also Indian critics, importantly. One goal of this account is to situate a seemingly new politics of knowledge that we talk about today and debate today in historical perspective. And I hope indeed that this account may recover resources to be used in knowledge debates today. Looking at these earlier knowledge debates, I suggest, has contemporary relevance. So I want to turn now to some of the interventions that this account makes, and especially here, methodological interventions. There's a whole host of interventions in the history of the company and the histories of South Asia and the British Empire. But I think for this group, I will focus on the methods at work here and how those differ from existing methods. My approach, as I've said, is something I'm calling a history of ideas of knowledge, highlighting here the ideas part to suggest that this is not a history of structures or cultures or systems of knowledge. These are the kind of accounts that have dominated that new field. It's a history of ideas of knowledge. And I'll say more what this means and why I think it's worth doing. So as many in this group may know, the history of knowledge has emerged in the last 10 or 20 years as one of the major new approaches to history, one of the major new fields. There are centers for the history of knowledge in places as far-flung as Lund, Sweden, where I gave a talk last week, to other parts of continental Europe, to the United States, and to Asia. You see this phrase being used for projects emerging out of universities in many corners of the world now. As it's usually understood, the history of knowledge is really an offshoot of social history, cultural history, and especially the history of science. A lot of the early debates around what the history of knowledge was and should be had to do with a kind of dissatisfaction among historians of science about their own label. What is science? What isn't science? What counts as science versus something that, we might now call pseudoscience or something that would fall in the arts and humanities? Science itself was an unsatisfactory term for many historians of science, and so they turned to knowledge. And that's one of the important origins for the history of knowledge. At the same time, others with a background in social history and in cultural history became interested in this concept and category of knowledge, seeing it as meaningful and getting at things that they weren't able to do without using and focusing on that term. Now, as it's been understood so far, the history of knowledge really emphasizes systems, institutions, other kinds of structures. I'll give a few examples of this in a moment. But knowledge is understood as having really a present day category that we use to make sense of the past, rather than emerging in different forms through the ideas of historical actors. So when we talk about the rise and fall of past knowledge economies and systems, revolutions. We're not saying that people at the time thought in those terms, but we're using those terms by analogy with these kinds of events today to make sense of the past. We see that we're living through a knowledge revolution in our own time. We observe a knowledge economy around us in our own time. We analyze various knowledge systems in our own time. And we say that there were such phenomena in the past as well. Now, as a result of this kind of approach, the history of knowledge is almost synonymous with the history of information or intelligence. These words are used almost interchangeably by many historians in this field. So a few examples here. And I think this will give you a sense of the way the history of knowledge has developed so far. The classic work in the field, I think most would agree, is Peter Burke's A Social History of Knowledge, which he subtitled from, at least for the second volume, from the Encyclopédie to Wikipedia. And I think his subtitle for the whole 2-volume series, at least one that he considered, was From Gutenberg to Google. So suggesting that there's a way that you can, from a very zoomed out perspective, observe changes in knowledge systems all the way from ancient times, or at least early modern times, to the present, to the age of Wikipedia, which was a little bit more new when he was writing this. I think he wrote this second volume even in 2010 or something. A couple other examples here will show you that this is a larger trend in this field. It's not limited to his classic account. You can see here the subtitle of another book, From Alexandria to the Internet, and of the most recent of these 3 books, From the Age of Reason to the Age of Algorithms. So these are books that really take a system-level perspective on knowledge, that try to look at knowledge institutions like libraries, like the internet, databases. What they don't tell us very much about, I think, is how historical actors themselves thought about knowledge. They seem to suggest that knowledge is an important category in modern times that we can develop theories about, and we can even project those theories onto the past. But they're not very concerned with how people in the past themselves thought about knowledge as a concept. I'll give you a quote from Peter Burke, the great historian of culture and society who wrote the middle book here, Social History of Knowledge. He wrote that book was intended, or that 2-volume set was intended to examine intellectual environments rather than intellectual problems. The environment, but not actually the kind of debates and expressions made within that environment. The culture, but not the contents of political discourse. And I think this is representative. I don't think that this is an exceptional claim. I think this really is true of most historians of knowledge. They eschew a focus on historical actors' utterances and aims. They don't really think about agency and authorship. They think more about systems, structures, changes to those systems and structures, and even, let's say, cultures and discourses. But I would suggest that this really is a limitation for all of the insights generated by this approach, which are many, and I don't mean to dismiss them. It does come with limitations. For one thing, if this field seeks, as it often says it does, to inform today's debates about knowledge, surely it is actually important to recover earlier such debates in the terms in which they were waged, not only to, in Peter Burke's terms, look at intellectual environments and at the culture of political discourse, but at intellectual problems, at the contents of political discourse. We might actually want to understand the kinds of vocabulary used to talk about knowledge in the past, the way knowledge was conceptualized. We might want to have a genealogy of our own concept of knowledge, reaching back into the past and understanding how we came to think about knowledge the way that we do today. None of that, I think, is possible, in fact, without doing exactly what these approaches avoid doing, without looking at historical actors, utterances, and their aims. Now, looking at utterances and aims, thinking about authorship, thinking about agency, examining texts, examining language, all of this is what is some of the most famous aspects, some of the hallmarks, really, of intellectual history, at least in the contextualist tradition. And this includes the history of political thought. The contextualist approach, first developed by Quentin Skinner in the 1960s, based on earlier influences, of course, and continuing today as the major form of intellectual history, at least in the Anglophone world, focuses exactly on the intentions of authors. Skinner's famous question that he says everyone needs to ask about a text to study it and understand its meaning is, what was the author doing? What did certain words, phrases, arguments mean in the context of those other works that informed that author, in the context of the political or other debates of the time that the author was trying to intervene in? You have to read around a text, situate that text in context to understand its purpose. So more broadly, this is a focus on what historical actors have said and what they meant and what they were trying to do by saying it. This focus on intention on the part of the author has been broadened by many successors to Skinner, although he's still alive, still kicking, and still developing his own theory. More recently, intellectual historians have focused on issues of reception, of circulation, and of geography, of place, thinking not only about what an author read and what debates they were involved in, but how their ideas then traveled and transformed, how they were shaped by the places that they emerged from and circulated through. So this contextualist tradition continues to evolve. But again, I think its hallmarks are contextualism, in the sense of situating a text in context, looking at aims and utterances, looking at language and what it meant, what it was trying to achieve. Some examples of this approach from maybe the pioneering example by Peter Laslett, his edition of Locke's Two Treatises of Government, to some of the essays of Quentin Skinner, including his famous Meaning and Understanding in the History of Ideas, the 1969 essay that kicked off this approach to intellectual history, and to a slightly more recent book written by my doctoral advisor, and bringing this intellectual history approach into the study of empires, and especially the British Empire. So at the same time that I think intellectual history provides a method that can be used to address some of the limitations of the history of knowledge, at the same time, I think there's a reciprocal benefit from these two fields interacting and merging. There are, of course, things missing from intellectual history, especially when we think about it in connection with that word and concept knowledge. Intellectual historians actually haven't been, up till now, very interested in the concept of knowledge. They've been interested in certain branches of knowledge. So John Pocock, for instance, has written about the politics of historiography. And you can see he and other intellectual historians, concerned with how these different fields, like history, connected with the politics of different times and places in which they were developed and practiced. But you don't see a concern with knowledge as a larger analytical category. And that, of course, is the common basis for the history of knowledge. If there's anything that unites the disparate approaches of historians of knowledge, it's that recognition of the importance of knowledge as an analytical category. It's a focus on that category. And intellectual historians have not looked at that category. they have not done what I think they can do, which is recognize that knowledge has been a significant concept for historical actors, not only for us in the present, but for many people in the past, who, it turns out, certainly in my case, were highly articulate on the subject of knowledge. So in other words, it's not only modern theorists who have thought in a sophisticated way about knowledge as a concept. For generations, for hundreds of years, people in the past were doing this as well. And intellectual historians have the tools to investigate those earlier conceptions of knowledge. And finally, I think this is quite important for historians of ideas and political thought to take on board a concern with knowledge, because it would help them respond to one of the great challenges to their approach. I've been talking so far about the contextualist tradition of intellectual history, but of course there's another quite different continental approach to intellectual history, whose greatest practitioner was Michel Foucault. For Michel Foucault, power and knowledge were bound together indissolubly. They were inextricably linked. There was a permanent and deep-set relationship between power and knowledge. He equated the two, in other words. Now, historians of ideas and political thought have never really dealt seriously with this proposition. Although for Foucault, power and knowledge go together forever and are indistinguishable from each other, I don't think historians of ideas and of political thought have addressed that proposition at all. And of course, if true, that proposition would challenge much of what they have done. But I think that there is a response that would emerge from intellectual historians examining the concept of knowledge in the past. I think what they would find, and what I have found, is of course a contingent relationship between power and knowledge. They're not indistinguishable. The relationship between them can be and has been figured in multiple ways. It's subject to endless rethinking. The relations between power and knowledge may be deep, but they're not fixed. They're in fact malleable, and they can be remade. That's an insight that we need from intellectual historians that would advance not only the history of knowledge, but would advance intellectual history. So to summarize what I've been saying here, the history of knowledge hitherto has been unconcerned with ideas. It's been concerned much more with structures and cultures, with systems, with revolutions and economies. It's been cultural structural, if I can hyphenate those two adjectives. Meanwhile, the history of ideas has been unconcerned with knowledge, at least knowledge at large, at least knowledge as an analytical category. You don't see historians of ideas tracing a genealogy of knowledge in the way that they have done for other concepts. You don't see them addressing Michel Foucault's provocation that knowledge and power are indistinguishable from each other. And so all of the limitations of both fields, I suggest, can be addressed by adapting the concerns of the one, the concerns of the history of knowledge, to the methods of the other, the methods of intellectual history. Hence, I call this approach a history of ideas of knowledge. Now, I think there are two different ways to do this. There are two different possibilities for a history of ideas of knowledge. Now, one I've kind of already alluded to. This would be to track the changing meanings of knowledge, something that's been done for other big words attached to big concepts like the state and the economy. You can read very fine intellectual histories tracing the changing meanings of state and the changing meanings of economy over centuries and in different linguistic contexts, looking at different cognates and alternatives. You don't have any such history, as far as I'm aware, of the word knowledge. and in any language that I'm aware of. Now, that's actually not the approach I take in my book. I don't trace such a genealogy, although I think someone should. Instead, I take the second approach, which is to examine how ideas of or about knowledge arose and changed in the course of political debates. So to look at how knowledge as a concept was invoked in political debates, how knowledge and ideas about knowledge, in fact, changed in the course of those debates, how it was yoked to politics in various times and places, in different settings. In other words, I'm looking at the politics of knowledge, with politics understood as a set of debates that can be excavated and whose intentions and vocabularies can be recovered. I think there are great benefits to this approach. First of all, a recognition that historical actors have been highly articulate on the subject of knowledge. It's not only the Michel Foucaults of the world who have analyzed this concept in some depth and actually have given it meaning. Knowledge has been a meaningful category from a long time past, and recovering its meanings is a worthy goal. For one thing, we might situate our own politics of knowledge, a kind of trendy phrase that you see cropping up a lot, in historical perspective. And for another, you might indeed recover materials from past knowledge debates to be used in present knowledge debates. So, humbly and with all of the typical caution that a historian has when we talk about the present, I do hope that my book has something to say of relevance to present day knowledge debates as well. And I think, and I want to kind of talk a little bit about this for anyone interested, I do think that this is a particularly valuable project when it comes to the East India Company and British India and the fields of colonial knowledge and the history of information, which have really developed in that context. A lot of the seminal works in the history of knowledge cultures, colonial knowledge, histories of information and intelligence have been written about exactly the period and even sometimes the people and projects that I write about in my book. So this is fertile ground for a methodological revision. It's fertile ground, I think, for rethinking the history of knowledge, because in fact, many histories have already been written about this period, and mine is radically different. I'm going to go through very kind of briefly here the historiography of the East India Company's engagements with knowledge. And let's say knowledge in British India, knowledge in the Raj more generally. And I think you'll see that these are quite different from my approach and show a lot of the same preoccupations and limitations of the history of knowledge as it exists now, more broadly. So interest in the East India Company's engagements with knowledge, at least modern interest in that subject, can be traced to the post-Second World War period, when you have a number of area studies departments cropping up in Western universities, when you have histories of empire being written in the period of decolonization when the major empires in the world are crumbling, and when you have historians in the new nation states of the world themselves, including India, themselves trying to rethink their past. And so you get some early books about the company's engagement in Orientalism, in the old sense of the word, the study of Indian and more broadly Asian languages and antiquities and cultures. And from an early date, there's a sense that the changing interests of the company and its officials in Indian languages and cultures and religions and all of that are related to its political aims and its own political changes. So there's a sense that it's politics and its political ideology are related in some way to its activities in the realms of scholarship. But this emerging kind of history of ideas doesn't get very far before the cultural turn comes early. In 1969, with the appearance of David Kopf's British Orientalism and the Bengal Renaissance. This is a major book which shapes the field going forward. Kopf talks about rival cultural formations in British India facing off against each other for a period of 6 decades. He identifies first what he calls an Orientalist or eastward-facing cultural formation. These are British officials and their institutions devoted to a study of the Indian past, sympathetic to that past, and trying to resurrect and reinvigorate it. On the other hand, he identifies an Anglicist cultural formation, another set of officials, their institutions, dead set against Indian cultural traditions and trying to impose European and especially English cultural traditions in their place. So this is really a structural account. It's about cultures that face off against each other in the form of structures like colleges and groups of scholars working together on projects. It's cultural and structural at the same time, and it understands knowledge through that sort of systematic approach. Now, the next big thing happens a decade later with the appearance of Edward Said's Orientalism, which of course completely transforms the meaning of that word. For Said, there's something sinister in the word. All such cultural projects in the past, unlike in Kopf's admiring description, were tools of domination. And yet, crucially, Said, too, is really adopting a structural and cultural approach to the subject. He talks about discourse in the way that Foucault talked about discourse, as a kind of structure that goes beyond individual aims and agency. And it was this Saidian approach to knowledge and power, especially with regard to European empires in the East, that shaped a generation of scholars of colonial knowledge. Now, although Said didn't care very much about India in particular, he was focused more on the Arab world, the Muslim world. Most of his followers, in fact, the greater part of them, were focused instead on India. Certainly among historians who followed his approach, the greatest number were historians of India, of South Asia, like Bernard Cohn, like Nicholas Dirks, and other scholars of what was called colonial knowledge. There are a great many of these in the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the 2000s, who took on board Said's approach, treated knowledge as a tool of domination, and weren't so concerned with particular debates around knowledge. They saw these as epiphenomena, kind of incidental aspects of a continuous project of cultural domination. So again, much like Kopf, not so concerned with ideas, concerned with cultures, concerned with structures. Finally, really in reaction against this approach, you have the work of Chris Bailey in 1995, Empire and Information, a magisterial history of the East India Company and then the British Raj's knowledge projects. For Bailey, too, however, the approach was systematic. Knowledge for him was basically an interchangeable concept with information or intelligence. He wanted to understand systems. He didn't care so much about individual utterances or articulations. None of the systems he elaborated, like the Indian ecumen, would have been intelligible to people living at the time. So I want to suggest that although there have been ongoing works and bodies of scholarship on the subject of the company and its engagements with knowledge, few of them have really looked seriously at how historical actors thought about knowledge, from the cultural formations of Kopf to the colonial knowledge of Said's followers to the information and intelligence of Bailey and the Cambridge School of South Asian History. You get a series of cultural structural approaches, much like those that have shaped the new history of knowledge. What I call for instead is studying the company's knowledge debates in their own terms, trying to understand how participants in those debates, British, European, Indian, Asian, understood knowledge and invoked it in political debates. I think this is quite different. Now, of course, there have been studies that are biographical or focused on particular fields of knowledge that have paid much more attention to individuals, their utterances, and their aims. But then what's missing is this larger scope, this larger sense that those were part of a wider history of the East India Company and not simply studies of individuals or studies of individual subjects. So I'd like to recover the scope of these and still look at those. I would like to maintain this wide scope and at the same time, this narrow understanding of knowledge through the terms of historical actors. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment and say goodbye to the members of my class here who are ready to leave, since it's the end of our class here. So, okay, anybody who has class, has anything else, you're of course free to go. We're at the end of our official class time. So thank you, and get in touch with me in the coming days about the final exam, final paper, anything else, okay? Great to see you all. Thanks for attending today. So again, to summarize here, what I'm doing is a history of ideas of knowledge, tracing ideas of and about knowledge used to legitimize the East India Company and the crucial period of tension between its two roles as company and state. I do this by reconstructing knowledge debates involving the company and its critics, Indian and European. And beyond that, I hope to situate what is seemingly a new politics of knowledge today in historical perspective. I think that's a broader implication of this approach. And I hope others engage with this approach and think about its use in other contexts. I don't mean my own study to be exhaustive, really, at all. I think there are many contexts in which this can be applied. I'm pursuing one in this book. Because I do think that using this approach can recover resources for us today. We have knowledge debates in the present. We have shifting and contested relations among companies, states, and knowledge. And we enter those debates blind. We address these problems with a blindfold on if we have not traced them in the past and thought about how they've been dealt with in the past. So let me pause again, John, and ask, how long would you like me to go on for the talk? I have, I can talk about each chapter in some degree of detail, but I don't want to go on too long. So can you maybe suggest how long I should spend on this part?
Let's do another 10 minutes. But if you reach a natural ending point early, that's okay. We can just transition to questions whenever.
Sorry, John, I think, although it says you're speaking, I don't hear you. So that may be on our side. But if you type it in the chat, I will take a look.
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me now? Any audio? Okay. All right. One moment.
Okay, well, let's set the tech aside, and I will just continue to talk for about 15 minutes. I hope that sounds okay. 15, 20 minutes. I can always go on longer in the Q&A about any of these topics, because there's a lot to say about each of these chapters. I just intend here to sketch them in outline form. Since I've already given the capsule form of the argument and talked in some depth about the methodology, I think it would be best to give you a sense of the chapters without, going on too long and boring you with them. So my first chapter is about Warren Hastings and this early moment of formulation of the company's ideas about knowledge. In governing Bengal from the 1770s in a direct way, the company is desperate to legitimize its conquests, its power, its extraction of resources from its new territories, and the chaos that really accompanies its assumption of power. The company had patronized scholars in a limited way from its very beginning. This was to give it a good image, to help with the practical business of its trade and its small territories. But this patronage assumed an ideological aspect from the 1770s as it came to be so politically necessary. Hastings compiled and translated law codes, built a madrasa and tried to build a Hindu seminary, sent expeditions to Bhutan and Tibet, and patronized dozens of other scholarly ventures. It's often been asked why he did this. My answer, and really the answer that he gives in his own words, is that all of this was part of a system of conciliation. The way this system worked was Hastings would defend the company state in this embattled period by patronizing European scholars and Indian learned elites who held sway with political classes and power holders. In India, on the one hand, in the case of the Indian learned elites, and in Britain, on the other hand, in the case of European scholar officials. This idea of conciliation, of trading knowledge for the sake of profit in terms of reputation and political legitimacy, suited a merchant and a sovereign. It was rooted in both British and Indian political thought. And so it was particularly appropriate for the company at this time. And it remains so for the next 6 decades, or at least much of that time. By the late 1780s, there was new pressure on the idea of conciliation. Hastings was called in for impeachment in Parliament, and Edmund Burke, his main prosecutor, associated conciliation with corruption. He said that all of Hastings' scholarly ventures had in fact been means to hide or compensate for his corrupt dealings, and really went no further than that. Meanwhile, a series of scandals was engulfing Hastings' temporary successor in Bengal, John Macpherson. Macpherson was a son of the Scottish Enlightenment, connected with a lot of literati back in Scotland, but at the same time, a corrupt operator. Certainly, he seemed to be skimming profits for himself from his public office. And so he contributed to giving conciliation a bad name at this time. He was every bit as much a target of Burke, at least of Burke's rhetoric, as was Hastings. Yet Hastings' permanent successor, Macpherson, was only in power temporarily for 18 months. Hastings' permanent successor, Cornwallis, did not try to abandon conciliation, but rather to purify it, to retrieve it from the disrepute into which it had fallen as a result of Hastings' trial and Macpherson's scandalous administration. Cornwallis found an ally in the most famous polymath of the era, now considered the founder of modern linguistics, Sir William Jones. William Jones was a judge in Calcutta, working for the company's administration, but he was also the founder of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and he was a leading scholar of his day. Despite having signed on to Hastings' administration and Macpherson's and befriending both predecessors, William Jones fit into the new order and supported Cornwallis. He maintained a kind of appropriately distant relationship between the Asiatic Society and the government in Bengal, helping to remove these allegations of corruption and show that, in fact, company scholar officials were pursuing scholarship as a enlightened hobby rather than a means of concealing or distracting from their corrupt dealings. And so all of this was going on during Hastings' trial. By the mid-1790s, Hastings is acquitted. Meanwhile, the French Revolution has shifted British public attention from the dealings of its own empire to what's going on the continent. There's a new kind of patriotic fervor around the empire, including the East India Company's empire in Bengal and in India. And a new celebration, in fact, of the East India Company and of Hastings, which extends to this idea of conciliation and the scholarly patronage that it had supported. So Hastings goes from being challenged, criticized, to ultimately being celebrated by the 1790s. A greater challenge is in store, though, in the 1800s. The new Governor General, Lord Wellesley, is intent on undoing the East India Company from within. Although he's nominally a delegate, a representative of the company's court of directors back in London, he really thinks that the company should be done away with and replaced with a much more imperial, much more monarchical system. No more trade, no more East India Company, rather a system of rule with a powerful ruler at its head. And of course, he sees himself as that powerful ruler. The major part of this effort is a new college of Fort William, a training institute for civil servants that is much more than that. It's not only devoted to the practical business of training governors and diplomats, although it's partly about that. It's also a huge ideological apparatus. It has these ostentatious disputations each year that welcome literati from across Asia and project the kind of might and splendor that are part of Wellesley's imperial vision. The directors see this correctly as a direct threat to their own vision of their empire as commercial and reflecting the company's hybrid constitution. They even see in Wellesley's college scheme certain attempts to remove their own patronage over civil servants and replace it with his. They recall Wellesley eventually reduce his college and found a competing institution in Britain itself. But although they may win this battle, they've in a sense lost the war, at least when it comes to the politics of knowledge. It's Wellesley's vision of using knowledge to expand and build an empire that inspires the next generation of scholar officials, leading the company's officials back in London, its directors, to turn away from the scholarly patronage of years past. They see its subversive potential now and are wary of continuing to support it. So the next generation of scholarly minded officials in the company's territories in India pursues an increasing range of projects that are both intended to increase the company's territory, grow its state, and expand what they know about the territories they're governing. They form massive surveys, massive data collection projects, all intended to kind of help govern and promote the company's good government. They see imperial expansion going hand in hand with these projects. One of these officials shown on the right here is Colin Mackenzie, the head of the Survey of Mysore. So, of course, as a result of this, territorial expansionist vision of the empire, very much in conflict with the old mercantile sovereignty of the company's leaders back in London sour further on scholarly patronage. Yet they begin to become receptive to new ideas emerging at the same time, or by the end of this period of the 1810s around native education. As I mentioned in the introduction, 1818 is a key moment when the company becomes paramount in all of India, at the same time that its trade is dwindling. This comes with new demands on the company. The company has to assert its ability to govern, its desirability as the ruler of India, even in a moment when it's lost its trade. It has to convince growing publics, and not only elites, in fact, as politics are changing in Britain and it's ruling a greater number and a greater diversity of subjects in India. It has to address these publics and convince them of its good government during an imperial and global age of reform. And so it's in the later phase of the company's existence, from the 1820s to 30s, that you see this enormous proliferation of debates around education. These debates can be found everywhere from Bombay to Madras to Calcutta and even to Singapore. Demands for good government and a growing sense that this is the way the company is going to defend its continued existence require an investment in public education systems at a moment when this is very new and not even really being tried yet back in Britain and back in Europe. But still, this lingering idea of conciliation is in play. Officials weigh conciliating elites against a new goal of educating masses. And it's this tension, I suggest, that lies at the heart of a famous controversy in the history of British India and of the British Empire, the Anglicist-Orientalist controversy. This controversy is central to the work of David Kopf, I mentioned earlier, and you may have encountered, if you've ever taken a course in British imperial history, Macaulay's Minute on Education. This is usually seen as a cultural debate. It's around the maintenance of Indian languages and cultural traditions versus the imposition of European ones. But I argue that this is grafted onto an existing debate, and really a much deeper and more long-lasting debate over this set of competing ideas, conciliating elites or educating the masses. The outcome of the debate, briefly, is the triumph of English education, but this fades away. The lasting outcome is the triumph of mass education over conciliation and company ideology. And that's the end of the book. So I do think we're getting towards the end of my time, and I just want to offer a brief conclusion before taking some questions and hopefully sorting out the speaker issues here so that I can do that in a moment.
If you can hear me, it would be great if we could get the
John,
audio
it says you're speaking, but I think when our tech guy came over and gave me the microphone, he messed up the sound, so I can't actually hear you now.
One moment, we'll try to figure something out. I may just call you in a moment. In the meantime, if anyone wants to submit written questions in the chat to everyone, you're welcome to do that. And Josh, if you can't hear me yet, I will just call you.
So sorry, John, I see you typing now. Let me please wrap up in a couple minutes, and then I will pass over to you and the speakers and try to get the sound fixed on our end.
All right.
So the books shown here and a whole host of others have been written on the topic of relations among companies, states, and knowledge today. You see the argument being made that companies, multinational corporations especially, are encroaching on knowledge arenas long led by states. So you see, in fact, the claim that science is being privatized, publishing is being turned into a for-profit business, universities are being corporatized. In all of these ways, corporations are asserting themselves in knowledge arenas long claimed by states. In other words, our time is also one of corporate involvement with knowledge. And so my study, I hope, does have some lessons, however cautious, however limited or duly humble lessons for the present. One of these is that companies today, as in the past, are not only economic, but also political actors. This means that they're accountable to outside constituencies. They can be pressured and they can be receptive to outside audiences, just as political bodies can be. They can assert ideologies. What's a mission statement, as every company has, but an ideological manifesto? And all of this means that there are certain approaches for influencing corporate behavior that work better than others. I found, for instance, that critics of the East India Company's engagements with knowledge, who saw these as shallow or self-interested, tended to have more luck when they took these commitments seriously, but said that the company was falling short of them. They tended to have more luck when they held the company up to its enlightened promises, when they expected more rather than less from the company as a promoter of knowledge. More broadly, I conclude that the state, the company, and knowledge are malleable categories. They've meant many different things over time. The relations among them have changed and can be changed in the future. So for all that we may be skeptical or critical about corporate involvement with knowledge today, this may take a very different shape in the future. And what we think of as the domains of the state were really only framed that way from the 19th century at the earliest. This suggests that there's no kind of natural domain of the state and a natural domain of the company or corporation. These roles can shift, have shifted, and we have ways to work through those complex relations. I see this as helpful in some way with our present debates around corporate involvement with knowledge, rather than seeing this simply as sinister or self-interested, for all that it may be in many cases. I see it as capable of being shaped for the better in the future as the roles of companies and states continue to shift. So thank you for your attention, dealing with the various hitches. I look forward to hearing questions and talking further about this with all of you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We will hope that we can get the audio fixed on your end if possible. But in the meantime, if anybody wants to submit a written question before I give my oral comments, can you hear me now?
Well, I've got you on a little phone here.
Okay, perfect.
We'll do it that way.
Okay, great. So I'll give some comments, and then if anybody in the audience online or in the classroom wants to raise a question, please feel free to indicate that in the chat or walk up to the front of the classroom. Okay, thank you so much for a really interesting talk and some really wonderful framing. I appreciate the wide scope of the historiography that you engage with, and the very fundamental questions that you're addressing in this project, which I think is incredibly important. And one thing that I keep coming back to is this intervention you're making in the knowledge power nexus. So we have, in many ways, I think, reached a very unproductive dead end when it comes to the idea that knowledge and power are, ineluctably connected, as you said, right? So if we have accepted Foucault perhaps too literally, then is there any room for not being cynical, right? For doing what, as you say, is appreciating ideas on the ideas for what they are, right? Ideology, ideology, rather than always searching for some underlying system, some secret motive, some kind of structure behind what people are doing and what they are the difference between what they say they do and what they are actually doing. And of course, this is not just Foucault. I mean, this is also, as you said, Said. But I would also point out that it's in many ways, it's also Marx, right? The search for hidden systems, the search for hidden conspiracy, the seeing of hidden power structures behind ostensibly other things, right? And I think what you are opening here is an opportunity for some earnestness rather than cynicism to say that, you know, it may be not all knowledge is destructive power. So you are showing in many ways how that knowledge power connection actually works in practice, which is very valuable. But I really, what I kept thinking about was the ways in which you're showing the ways that knowledge and power are not necessarily always connected in the way that people like Bailey were arguing. And so I think that's a super interesting intervention, and I really appreciated that. I have maybe you could respond to that really quickly. If you,
Sure, I'm hearing somebody else, I think, there too.
yeah, we just muted them.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so again, I think I approach this very much as let's see if I turn this microphone off.
I think the microphone is fine.
Get a lot of echo and I can't hear if I do. Okay, I'll try now. This is better, I think. Still good, John? Okay. So, I think that I very much approach this as an intellectual historian for whom, of course, we accept the possibility that people can lie. They can say things they don't mean. They can say things they don't believe at some deep level. But we also tend to think that there are consequences to that, and that to maintain credibility, to maintain legitimacy, you have to be seen at least to be acting in accordance with your stated ideology. So if you're going to then try to read between the lines in a Leo Strauss fashion, you have to have a reason to do so. You have to have some kind of evidence elsewhere that the actor, the author who wrote a statement didn't mean what they said. So you have to find some indication in another statement of theirs, or in private correspondence, or some hint that the language could be used in a different way. There has to be some evidence there beyond a kind of paranoia, right? So that's basically the kind of intuition that intellectual historians in the contextualist tradition tend to share, that saying something has consequences because you're expected to act in accordance with what you said. And there's a price to pay if you're a political figure who doesn't do what they said they're going to do. Not to say that, you know, there's a huge amount of flexibility there, right? Politicians can say many things and have them and change their minds, change what they say. There's lots of flexibility in political discourse. But at a basic level, you know, ideologies do shape and bind action. And so when the company announced a commitment to knowledge, it had to meet that up to some level. And critics, as I suggested at the end, critics of the company tended to have more luck shaping the company's behavior, reforming its behavior, when they tried to hold it up to its promises, rather than when they dismissed the possibility of its meeting them at all, because it was just a company or something like that. And I think that's useful to remember, that as critics or as potential skeptics about corporate power or corporate involvement with knowledge, we might have more luck reforming and shaping corporate behavior by holding corporations up to their enlightened promises. The Googles of the world who claim to be organizing the world's information, you know? Right. We may have luck with that approach than with dismissing that they can ever serve any positive function, you know? I think that's one sort of insight here.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm going to push my other questions to the back of the line to make room for some students who are asking questions. Let's look at this first one, written question. Thank you for this insightful, enlightening lecture. My question is about the natural history activities conducted by East India Company scholars and officials, both in India and maybe also in Guangzhou in southern China. How do you view the development of natural history as part of the politics of knowledge? And I would add to this question, I think it's a very appropriate question because you focus on knowledge as being not particularly scientific in the way we contemporarily define it, right? The science that they're discussing is very much literary in some ways and linguistic. So how would you address this question about natural history or maybe other quote unquote hard sciences?
Well, great. Thank you very much for the question. It's true, I didn't talk much about natural history here, although it shows up many times in the book. I think there's a broad point to be made here first, and then maybe I can say a few specific things about natural history. The broad point is that the kinds of disciplinary boundaries that we might take for granted today, the hardness of certain sciences versus others, and their division among different faculty members, those were not there at all in the company period. So you had someone like William Jones discoursing on the Greek roots of the shared Greek and Sanskrit roots of modern languages, and at the same time collecting botanical specimens and trying to identify different flora and fauna in Bengal. These activities overlap to a huge extent. There were, of course, many specific projects to investigate natural history. So Wellesley, whom I mentioned as the founder of this very ambitious college, he wanted natural history as one of the subjects taught at the college in Calcutta. He hired quite a well-known natural historian and mathematician as well at the time, who had been on Macartney's embassy to China, in fact, in 1793, and who had then settled in Calcutta, and somebody by the name of Dalwhinnie. And he also tried to keep the college running in some sense, even after it was reduced as an ambitious project by splitting off this natural history institution from the college. And so we have this amazing collection now of watercolors prepared by Indian artists for the company as part of this natural history institution that date from that early period of about 1804 to 6. So this was one among several natural history projects that was sponsored by the company or its personnel. And it went hand in hand with the other activities. I don't see there being a distinctive role for natural history or really any other branch of knowledge in the company's ideology. It was such a broad conception of knowledge that they had as being politically valuable. I think that's something surprising to a lot of the audiences I've talked to this project about, who want to say, well, what about mathematical knowledge versus linguistic knowledge? They didn't draw such distinctions, at least when it came to what the company should be involved in and what was beneficial for its activities and the justification of those activities.
Thank you. Let's go to our next question from a PKU student, Liao Yuanzhi. Professor Ehrlich, you emphasized that from the mid-18th century, Warren Hastings used systems of conciliation to mediate between the colonists, the intellectual elite, and the masses in India. However, since knowledge is always situational or contextual, knowledge is always being conciliated. So the question is, didn't the EIC utilize the system of conciliation to negotiate the knowledge on their own terms? Or is the way they are used just not obvious before Hastings? And I think another way to reframe this question might be, can we define conciliation for the audience?
Yeah, I think this is a great question because conciliation was a sort of a term of art and a particular term used by Hastings. So I think the term that you're kind of using is mediation, right? Talking about the mediation of knowledge. And again, I would say taking kind of a historian of science perspective here and looking at how knowledge was always brokered and traded from the beginnings of the company and far beyond those to earlier organizations and far beyond the end of the company. There's a long history of mediating knowledge as we might understand it today. But conciliation as a concept was framed by Hastings. And what it meant was that the company in its embattled state facing critics in Britain and India could patronize scholars both within the company's European ranks and learned elites that it was in contact with in India. And by patronizing these scholars, it would conciliate, meaning reconcile with or win over political classes and power holders on both sides of its operations in Britain and in India. So conciliation was a very interesting word in the 18th century. It was defined in a dual way by Samuel Johnson in his pioneering dictionary. It could mean either to reconcile or to win over. So it was something that a merchant could do and as a kind of bartering or negotiation. It was also something a king could do in terms of condescending to somebody and kind of lording over them, taking them as a subject. So it really was a way to reconcile the company's two roles in speech and hence in practice. It also had an important meaning because of Burke back in London, who had a famous speech on conciliation, which is both representative of its meaning and also may have had a particular resonance at the time. He wrote in a speech on conciliation with the American colonies that even the most despotic government is forced to truck and huckster. And so he talks about a far-flung polity like the British Empire having to conciliate different political communities and bring them into one framework and having to trade, act like a merchant to do so. So I think this is really the way that Hastings is using the term in this Burkean, Johnsonian way that it's being used back in Britain. And at the same time, conciliation has resonances in Indian political thought. It's often the English translation for the Persian term sulikul, which was a strategy of Mughal rule, which is sometimes translated now as universal toleration, but really it meant something similar, like accommodation among different political communities or within those communities. So coming out of the Indian tradition and the British political context, I think that's where conciliation gets its meaning and becomes such a key term used over and over again by Hastings and his successors, and almost always in the context of knowledge.
Thank you. Maybe this is somewhere where I can insert a question of my own, because it kind of follows up on this, which is how is what the East India Company is doing in terms of knowledge production or conciliation, how is that different in quality or in quantity or efficiency from other societies or governments? So how is it different from what the Mughals did or what their successor states in South Asia did? Or how is it different from, say, what the Qing Empire was doing at exactly the same time?
Well, I would say in one sense, it wasn't very, very different in the, in the sense that scholarly patronage was a duty or responsibility embraced by many polities in Asia at this time, and back in Europe too, where this was the duty of enlightened government. Was also being an enlightened king meant you patronized scholars and had books published and founded institutions like universities. So in that sense, it wasn't very different. What was different, I think, was that this was a mercantile company doing it. And that meant that they had to be more at the vanguard of these activities. They had to do more of this kind of thing and make more hay out of it because they were under such incredible pressure. Right. And because they were at risk of being dissolved basically throughout this whole period. So hence you see the company taking a very early role in education, like long before Parliament in Britain gives a grant for public education, the company is already discussing and building a system of public education. Though I should note that it doesn't put very much money into it. It does spill a lot of ink on the subject.
Right. Someone just wrote a follow-up question, which is, have you considered to compare the process in India with other British colonies?
Well, I haven't considered writing a comparative history, but I've tried to think about how this fit into the larger landscape of knowledge projects in the British Empire. And I was thinking at some point, as one, you have a book I know coming out, John, and you're probably thinking, what's my second project? Maybe you already know, but I've gone back and forth on a few ideas. One of these ideas would have been maybe stretch this out into a longer term and wider geographic story.
Yeah.
Tell a story about the British Empire, not only the East India Company. And I think ultimately I don't like the idea of writing that book, but I did think about trying to look at a history of ideas of knowledge on a broader canvas.
So I think another way of asking that question is to say, is this different in settler colonies versus India, or would become other colonies in Asia?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that the answer is probably yes, because, settler colonies, by their nature, had a different constituency. They had all of those settlers as well as all of those native subjects. The company in India was very much against colonization, as it called it, European settlement, and it saw that as a threat to its authority and fought against the attempts of reformers, usually called liberal reformers and the ideas of the time, who wanted to introduce European settlement. And so its politics of knowledge certainly was anti-settler colony.
Right.
And I think that in settler colonies, you have states using knowledge for political legitimacy, but probably in very different ways because they have different constituencies.
Yeah, of course. All right, let's run through some of these questions fairly quickly in the last 4 minutes. Are there any interactions between the East India Company's politics of knowledge and the other Europeans present in India, for example, the French and the Danish?
Yes. So I ended up using the term European scholar officials rather than British scholar officials because a lot of these are actually Europeans. And beyond that, they're also collaborating with Europeans, the Danish at Tranquebar and in Serampore, the French in Pondicherry and elsewhere. And there are Europeans entering the company's service as allies or employees throughout this period.
Great. We have a kind of process question for graduate students. As a postgraduate searching for topics for a thesis, we are encouraged to collect more local materials in India. How do you think the feasibility of focusing on the period of the early East India Company before mass education, how does that relate to using local materials? Are you able to use local materials for that period? Since EIC sponsored and worked with local intellectual elites of India, how can we find those voices of these Indian intellectuals?
Well, that's a great question. I think I came to think it was very important to spend time researching in India as well as in Britain. So I spent about a year in India on research, largely in Delhi and Calcutta, but also in Madras and Bombay and a few places elsewhere. The research is harder than if you're somewhere like the BL. The archives are more difficult to use, but you also may find things that don't exist elsewhere. So the records of the College of Fort William, the records of the General Committee of Public Instruction, the first education policy body in India, those are both only in India, for instance. And indeed, I wanted to bring out the stories not only of the European colonial officials, but also of Indian intellectuals and interlocutors of those company employees. So indeed, in many cases, those remained in India, although I found plenty of those in Britain too.
What research languages were you working in?
Largely English and also some Persian and occasionally French, and with a bit of difficulty, Arabic, Hindustani, with help. Yeah. But I did learn Persian.
That's very impressive. We will encourage all of our students to take up the vigorous language study required to study South Asia. Okay, well, we're about out of time. Thank you, everybody, for your questions, and thank you, everybody who attended. We still have 150 people listening in, which I think is great for the end of a 2-hour lecture. So we will give Professor Ehrlich a round of applause and let him rest his voice and his feet. Thank you for a wonderful talk and a wonderful book, and I hope that everybody gets a chance to read it soon.
Thank you so much, John, and everyone else in Beijing and elsewhere. I really appreciated this chance. Thank you.
Thank you.